So today we welcome Crispin Howarth, the Curator of Pacific Art at the National Gallery of Australia, who, while on sabbatical, has been further exploring the art of the Yuat River. Over to you, Crispin.
As members of the Oceanic Art Society, most of us are aware of the art forms of Papua New Guinea's Sepik River: masks, figures, shields, and flute stoppers. Today, I'd like to share a general survey of some of these Sepik arts, but of one of the Sepik's tributaries, the Yuat River. Yuat River cultures are relatively underdocumented, and very little is published on the visual art of this region, even though some of these artworks are absolute icons of oceanic art. The Yuat River is a fast-flowing, muddy southern tributary of the Sepik River. In some areas, it has high banks giving way to grasslands and rainforest before tapering off into endless swamps to the east and the west. During the later years of the 19th century and the early 20th century, the northern half of the island of New Guinea was a German colonial protectorate from 1884 to 1914. Many outsiders just did not bother with the Yuat River. Probably the first outsiders to enter the Yuat were the Kaiserin Augustin Fluss expedition members of 1912-1913. The Kaiserin Augustin Fluss expedition was a large scientific expedition mounted by several different institutions, scientific outfits, museums, and universities in Germany. After this large expedition, the river was briefly named the Dorfer River. The Yuat River people had a reputation amongst the neighboring tribal communities for being perhaps the most aggressive cannibals and headhunters in the entire Sepik region. Labor recruiters, gold prospectors, and other visitors and entrepreneurs tended to avoid the lower and middle areas of the river due to tales of cannibal tribes. From the early 1920s, with the establishment of the Australian Civil Administration, a system of district officers and patrol officers was organised for each of the regions of Papua New Guinea, as we know it today. The patrol officers were known as Kiaps, and they were directed to bring about pacification of tribal communities, which in turn brought Christianity, schools, and medical posts into the village life. For the Sepik River and the Yuat River, this began around 1926, with the Yuat River being brought under government control by 1928-1929. The Kiaps, the patrol officers, ordered entire communities to relocate their villages to the banks of the Yuat. Previously, villages were in more defensive positions inland. Such movement contributed to a massive upheaval for Yuat cultures between the 1920s and 1930s. The first to record the cultures of the Yuat River were Margaret Mead and Rio Fortune, a pair of anthropologists who worked in the area during 1932, only a few short years after the pacification push. Margaret Mead described her work in Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies as operating in a cultural vacuum that followed the cessation of traditional practices by the Yuat communities. And to quote Margaret, "Life stopped dead, like a clock of which the mainstring is broken. But the memory of that way of life, which had so recently and unwillingly been forsaken, was still vivid and green." Part of this societal collapse is the fact that big men, the chiefs, the warriors, could fight to the death in a normal circumstance. There was pride in a noble way to die, as was being hung, sentenced to death by Kiaps. It showed defiance, and the no-surrender stance of these once aggressive communities was completely cut to shreds by the idea of being arrested. The fear of government, that really meant something. Facing 6 months in prison while wondering if someone had stolen your gardens or was now, living with your wives. Losing your community position was an unbearable prospect, literally worse than death. So, the Biwat people live near the lower and middle region of the river. The Bun people to the south, further upriver. In the hinterland to the northeasterly side of the Yuat River, near to where the Yuat flows into the Sepik, are the Andawar people, who speak an Angoram language. The Biwat people, otherwise known as the Mundugamore from the writings of Margaret Mead, who was one of the first anthropologists in the area. She used the term Mundugamore, which actually more precisely comes from Mundukamo. However, Biwat and Mundugamore are quite often used in the literature referring to the cultures of the Yuat River. Also, the Andawar, and to a much lesser extent the Bun people, also share a level of cultural similarities, especially within their arts. We're focusing really here on the Biwat people. The Biwat are a relatively small community of around 2,000 or so people. Back prior to World War II, this may have been around 1,000 to about 1,500 people, stretching over 6 or 7 villages. As I said before, headhunting was an endemic part and parcel of life within the Yuat societies. Biwat boys were made to dispatch a captive, and there was no privilege or honour about it. It was simply done so the boy can be recognised as a man. This homicide wasn't an initiatory rite either. While these cultures, the Biwat, the Andawar and the Bun, had a justly deserved reputation because of the endless raids and ambushes and killing and paybacks, the fact that victims were cooked and eaten, they were also heavily reliant on trade with those very communities they would predate upon. The Biwat were traders in tobacco, betel nut and coconut, all of which was found in abundance in their region. They would trade with partners of the Chagriwa, the Maramba, the Mekmek people in the west, the Angoram towards the Sepik River, and to the Yol people in the swamplands to the east, and also upriver to the Miak people. What would they trade for? Well, they would trade for stone adze blades, lime, expertly made clay cooking pots and vessels, basketry fish traps, and woven sleeping bags. Trade negotiations could be precarious. Mead noted their disdain for the Yol people, and to quote Mead, "For these miserable swamp people, the Biwat preserve a contempt tinged with a sense of their usefulness as makers of pots and baskets. They said they were careful not to kill all of them. There would be no makers of pots left alive otherwise." The Biwat also imported and exported knowledge of songs, magic, and accompanying ceremonial objects. By the time foreigners entered the Yuat, there were no permanent cult houses remaining. All ritual objects were kept in their owners' houses. In the 20th century, cult houses were only really documented by a series of 25 sago staves, amazingly painted sago staves, which, once placed together, create this huge image you see in front of you here. It's about 8.6 meters tall by 2.2 meters wide and was collected during the French Corrigan expedition of the 1930s. There's also a field photograph by Margaret Mead, and with this field photograph, it records this giant assembly as being placed against 2 coconut trees during yam festivals. So, this very fleeting reference to any kind of cult house or house tambourine, perhaps they were ephemeral temporary structures which were not meant to actually stay in a permanent position like you see house tambourines, cult houses elsewhere on the Sepik. Central to Biwat religious beliefs was the great ancestral mother crocodile, and you can see a giant crocodile on this sago stave set of panels. This crocodile spirit was called Ashin, and it was she who created everything. Biwat people would not eat the meat of a killed crocodile, but would take its head, from which the lower jaw with its pointed teeth would be used to mark the skin of young initiates. Initiation, unlike elsewhere in the Sepik region, was not segregated. Women would choose to undergo initiation, gaining the right to view the ritual objects and other objects. So that's quite amazing. In many Sepik River cultures, initiation for women was a very separate set of ideals and observances compared to male. However, for the Biwat, it would seem that men and women were treated equal for initiations. Mead recorded a fascinating insight. Men born with the umbilical cord twisted around their throats were destined to become artists, to continue the fine, tight tradition of Biwat art. The high relief carving on shields, it is they who carve the wooden figures that fit into the ends of sacred flutes, the embodiments of the crocodile spirits of the river. Now, with Sepik masks, all the masks seem to be pierced through the eyes with the intent that these masks are worn over the face. And some examples still retain their decorations and the cane and fibre sections that secured them to the wearer's head. The oval on the forehead of this mask is likely to represent a baler shell ornament. The context of these masks is uncertain. Some terms have been recorded, such as yakak, gugu, and tumbai. However, these might be personal names of a depicted spirit or a general term. We don't currently know. There is still a lack of information. Interestingly, Barry Craig notes that none of these kinds of masks found their way into German museum collections until the 1920s, which is in keeping with most of the masks appearing in collections from the 1930s until about World War II. Margaret Mead noted there are two types of wooden mask, representations of bush spirits, manjimi, and representations of water spirits, saki. It seems none of these masks depicted ancestors. There are no images of these masks actually in use in context within Yuat River cultures amongst the Biwat people. Here is an image of one which has been traded out into a neighbouring community on the Sepik River. This image here shows the mask as it's been repurposed. And of course, with these masks would have been various information, cultural information, which would have been taken, broadcast, adopted and appropriated within the importing culture. Here again is an image by Felix Spicer. You can see the Biwat mask is attached to a giant crocodile spirit being, which is being made to swallow initiates. Large ancestor figures exist, but of the handful known from the region, they seem to be from the communities to the swampland to the west of the Yuat River's mouth. This figure here in this slide is the only one I know which has all the hallmarks of an archaic style relating to Biwat sculpture. Again, it's unclear whether these are ancestral or meant to represent spirit beings, as they have long been described as just hunting gods. Chris Boylan recorded the term pake for this type of shield, and the term pakya is a recorded term for a shield at the Australian Museum collected in 1938. It's good to point out there's no singular name, as we're looking at several communities, all creating very similar arts. So it's very difficult to state certainty in a singular manner when we are looking at these arts. Ear ornaments like these apparently represent the eyes of the ancestral crocodile Ashin, and they're called Mubangasa. All Mundugamo men consider themselves the sons of the ancestral crocodile mother. The top one here was in a private collection, and was displayed in the 2015 exhibition Myth and Magic Art of the Sepik River at the National Gallery of Australia. The lower example in this image has a break at one side, so one head is missing, but it's still a fabulous sculpture. And you can see it's a remarkable work. It looks almost like a fish or a cockerel's head coming out the side. This is in the collection of University of Queensland's Anthropology Museum. These two hairpins are termed manion. Several of these exist in collections. A series of hooks really speak to the linkages between the Yuat River and the communities of the southern hinterlands of the Sepik River itself, from the Chambry Lakes, the Hunstein Ranges, the Blackwater and the Korowari Rivers, right through to the swamps of the Yuat River. If you look close enough, there's also a hook motif association of these areas that does not seem to cross into the arts of the Yatmal people who dominate the Sepik River itself. Now, these so-called armband figures or belt figures, these are something of an enigma. They are said to be attachments to a belt, but in contemplating them, they look to share similarities to late 19th century Yatmal armband adornments, with a long shaft at the neck to be placed into an armband during festive events. So far in my searches around collections in the UK and Australia, I have located less than a dozen of these, which is remarkable, as all examples except for one in the Cambridge Anthropology Museum are truly resolved masterpieces of form. Suspension hooks are also known from the Yuat. These two are in the Australian Museum collection, and while probably made for trade to foreigners in the 1930s, they relate to sorcery, where certain people with the knowledge to do so can transform into pigs. This is a type of object that is exceptionally rare. It was something that was shown to young men, probably initiates, during their learning period, and it revealed hidden or protected knowledge of the world. It's covered in frogs, fish, snakes, and crocodiles, so it's very likely to represent water spirits, as I mentioned before, called generally Saki. And it may also be associated with the great spirit crocodile Ashin. Perhaps quite significantly, the painted designs, which may be the most important part, are obscured from view behind the tassels on the underside. Finial figures, roof figures. This type of sculptural form has long been recognised as finial figures, and they're exceptionally rare figures and are thought to be placed on the top of temporary cult houses. Much has been made about the downward gaze on some of the better known sculptures and the belief that the intention is to be viewed from below. Each is hollowed in the base section for wedging onto a roof post or beam. However, of the 20 or so I've located, and I've studied 16 of them up close, only one exhibited any weathered patina expected in a tropical environment. Also, the carved recesses in the bases have no compression marks, as you would come to expect from wedging them on a post. It may be possible that these roof figures were only brought out and displayed for short periods of time, or were shown only within the homes of their owners, as several show a patination which is more in keeping with objects which have been kept indoors for decades within a community, within a meeting house, or within a domestic house. Plantation owner and labour recruiter and art dealer E.J. Warhope operated at Awa on the coast in the 1930s near the mouth of the Sepik River. He recorded the name Paki for this type of figure, and they were noted to be dwelling house ornaments credited with powers to assist in hunting, fishing, or to ensure a bountiful crop of yams. Warhope also noted that they warned off intruders and uninitiated youths, and that in many villages A house tamboran no longer exists, and only a few of the carvings are left in the villages. This is an indication that there were cult houses of some scale long before the 1930s, when the end of headhunting radically changed Biwat life. Our knowledge of cult houses is slim at best. The squat position has been interpreted as a reference to the legendary Biwat culture hero Bilishoy. And perhaps these are representations of Bilishoy. That said, not all figures take this position. So I believe, that we're looking at more than one identity, even within the small corpus of 20 extant figures. Bilishoy was the child of a man and a female Manjimi spirit, who, when he grew older, he became a violent, spear-wielding trickster, whose exploits duped and killed many people. He collected many heads and was widely feared. In one story, Bilishoy convinced several people to stand in a line, and then, as a trick, he speared them all together and mocked them as they slowly died upon the spear. The malevolent life of Bilishoy came to an end after he pretended to help men in constructing a cult house. But once he had managed to straddle the roof of the cult house, he dropped a log from a great height, killing some men below. The rest of the men attacked Bilishoy by throwing their spears upwards. But Bilishoy, balanced high up on the roof, deflected the spears easily with his elbows until a man decided to use a spear thrower. And with a spear thrower, you gain more distance and a better aim. The spear caught Bilishoy in the face or eye, and he plummeted from the roof stone dead. Now, flute stoppers. Flute stoppers are a form of finial for large bamboo flutes, and they often take a human shape with an oversized looming head upon a stocky body, making for a really striking confrontational stance. A term for these is wusia. But of course, each flute and its stopper had its own personal name. The eyes are often gleaming mother of pearl, but cowrie shell and even slivers of pig's tusk were used and inlaid into the eyes. When in cultural use, they were painted and decorated with cassowary feathers. The chin ridge was pierced through for a thick beard of human hair hanging down in dreadlock knots. The figures were as highly decorated as their owners during festival events. They are regarded as the children of Ashim, the mother crocodile. Both the flute and the initiation rites amongst the Biwat can be spoken of with the same name, Ashim. These finials are only one part of the larger object, the flute itself. This is made from a large section of bamboo, usually around 5 or 6 feet long. Sometimes the flute was completely wrapped in shell jewellery, which, along with the decorations on the flute stopper finial itself, would leave little of the figure except for the small area of the face, the mouth, the nose and the eyes. But that's all that would remain visible of the wooden sculpture. Such a heavily decorated instrument was almost impossible to actually use. Flutes were commissioned to mark the status of men. So I suggest they had developed into a form of prestige object associated with a man's clan identity and community standing than to be a musical instrument anymore. I estimate there are some 120 flute stopper figures in museums and private collections, with the majority of those collected in the mid to late 1930s or between 1950 and 1970. As Biwat headhunting culture came to a sudden halt in the late 1920s, two other things happened. One, like elsewhere on the Sepik, there was an explosion of art production. Carvers found revenue selling artifacts. Objects were not only created for community use, but to sell. A century ago, carvers who had mastered the style canons of their community also made art of equal quality for external consumption. Undoubtedly, this happened amongst the Biwat also, and amazing objects would have been made solely for sale. The art production bubble was short-lived because World War II got in the way. Biwat art made for sale post-World War II and right into the 1970s shows a widening gap between the carvers' skill sets and their knowledge of traditional formats. The flute stopper figures which exist, which were created during this period post-World War II, seem to tend to be crude, blocky, or otherwise have morphed away in style. Secondly, young Biwat men in the 1930s had a new opportunity ahead of them: travel. The world had opened up to them. As gold prospector and labour recruiter Jack Thurston stated, he had no trouble recruiting. Men who returned from their time working on plantations had a better balanced diet and had become much healthier than the men who'd stayed in the villages. To quote Thurston, their appearance, their talk, and the desire of the young men to see the outside world meant that recruits were soon volunteering to go down to the salt water themselves. Many Biwat men took up the opportunities of indentured labour at plantations on the coast and on the island of New Britain. Here they earned wealth. Within Biwat society, social mobility included payments to earn and claim your right to the status of ownership of a flute and its stopper figure. Suddenly, in a matter of a 2-year period, young men were able to come back to the village with wealth to commission their own flute stopper, and sponsor the associated ceremony to occur. The systems of old Biwat society were under great strain. There was no headhunting anymore. Christianity was taking hold. The introduction of education in Western forms meant the decade between 1929 and 1939 was all change. It is no surprise that the majority of Biwat flute stopper figures have collection dates to the mid-1930s or later. Now, there are major differences in style. Among the corpus of flute stoppers known, some are clearly archaic. 2 examples shown here at the Sainsbury Research Unit in Norwich in the UK are truly ancient and perhaps worthy of radiocarbon dating. There is a handful of around 12 or so flute stoppers which look to be incredibly old. But there is one flute stopper which stands out. It's not necessarily the most archaic of these figures, but it is stylistically in its own bracket, and it has the earliest known collection date of 1891. 1891 is more or less 30 years earlier than most of the others which were collected in the 1930s. 30 years might not seem much, but if we compare 2024 to 1994, our world has greatly changed across that time period, and equally there would have been major cultural shifts for the Biwat people across those 3 decades. By 1891, no foreigner had entered the Yuat River. Miss Flute Stopper entered Museum Victoria's collections in March 1891 and was acquired from Methodist missionary R.H. Rickard, who was active in New Britain between 1887 and 1889. Visually, it has differences to most of the known flute stopper figures. And this is really interesting because we can use this as a date range of the late 1880s to begin to assess the entire body of known figures to place them pre or post this progression in style of flute stopper figures. To conclude, this is the beginning, simply known at this stage as the Biwat Project. Myself and OAS members Kevin Conroy and Bernard de Grun began a discussion over lunch in Brussels in 2018 on the cultural arts of the Biwat. We quickly realised that while the arts of these regions have long been recognised, There's no satisfactory survey of these arts. Many questions are unanswered. How many of these sculptures are known to actually exist? Are there yet untapped and unpublished documentation to shed more light on the cultural arts of the Yuat River? The idea continued for years being just an idea. However, a collective meeting in London last June of interested parties at the Wyvern Research Institute showed support for the Biwat project. The deep dive research work will begin in 2025, and ultimately we aim to publish on Yuat River flute stoppers and the broader Yuat River arts. The aim is to produce a book which will provide a definitive reference work on these cultural arts, but will remain a serious resource for decades to come. Thank you.